Hi, Christina. How are you?
Hi, Sass. Good. How are you?
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today as part of our Women in Renewables campaign. We're really happy to have you.
Of course. I'm so happy to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, for anyone that's watching, Christina is the Director of Growth and Innovation over at How Good, and she also created the Sustainable Network, which is trademarked the word sustainable. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So this all started, I want to say, probably around 2015, 2016. I started to study how to use business as a force for good. And very shortly, I learned that not all business was operating in a good manner.
Yeah.
I was working in fashion at the time, and so I really started to naturally study the fashion supply chain and fashion supply system. And I was like so surprised with everything I was finding, and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like as a consumer, like I really wish I knew this before to make more informed purchasing decisions.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, that started to expand not just into fashion, but also into my diet, consumer products I was buying. And so I really just wanted to develop a community and a
Mhm.
channel to share this truth disrupting information. And that's kind of what the Sustainable Network is. And from there, taking that interest, I really wanted to develop that in a professional sense. So I decided to go back to school, and I'm now studying sustainability management at Columbia. And I also professionally joined How Good, which is the largest ingredient and product sustainability database in the world. So all of my worlds, I feel like in a creative manner and a professional manner, have come together so nicely right now.
Yeah, it sounds like you really have figured out what it is you're passionate about and how to interweave it both into your passion projects and your work life. It's interesting that you speak to like being in the fashion space. I know fast fashion right now is a really big issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Like years ago when this all started happening, like no one was thinking about it. And I'm so grateful to have been a part of this journey, fashion and beyond, over the last 5 years. It's been amazing, I think, what consumers have done in terms of market forces. So that's certainly been energizing.
Yeah, no, and I think it's also started to lead, what we know today is ESG, environmental social governance goals for anyone watching, and how companies are starting to position themselves really with a deeper understanding of sustainability and why it's important. So
Absolutely.
I would be really interested to know from your perspective as, a director at How Good, how you guys kind of perceive ESG goals and, what you guys are doing within your own company.
Yeah, definitely. So ESG is, I would say, certainly a big buzzword right now.
Mhm.
And the more you study it, the more tangible it becomes. And it really is obviously relevant for allocation of capital, but also, I think, just understanding the supply system within any given category or industry that you're in. So, I can certainly speak and provide a couple of examples on ESG and how that intertwines with my work at How Good. But I think one of the most tangible things to probably point out that we're seeing on the food side of things, at least, is this idea that here in the US, there are so many areas experiencing extreme water scarcity issues.
Yeah.
And so what's going on is like these massive meat companies like Tyson and Cargill are actually having to shut down certain plants because of water scarcity issues. Like today, they've already been shut down and things
Wow.
along those lines. And so obviously that starts to disrupt production forecasts and things along those lines, which ultimately comes down to impacting the bottom line. Um, so those are things that I'm studying right now. And then, so that's happening today in food, in meat, very specific example, but at a high level, so many suppliers are basically, I think CDP basically just came out and said that 1.26 trillion dollars of supplier revenue is likely to be at risk over the next 5 years due to climate change. And so basically, where their costs will go up, then the corporate buyer who is buying from the supplier, their costs are going to go up as
Yeah.
well. And so these types of things, in terms of like, yes, their bigger picture in the next couple of years, are ultimately going to impact the bottom line. And so, from an investor standpoint, That's why it's so important to understand what that ripple effect might look like and start predicting. And I mean, just from like a financial perspective, you definitely want to take into consideration these things and make sure you allocate your capital so that you're doing so in places that have the least amount of climate risk from my perspective.
Yeah.
So
no, I think, you speak to the importance. People don't realize how much the bottom line in all industries is going to be affected with the shortages that we're experiencing, whether it's water. I mean, I know in our industry right now, our lead times on being able to get materials to do sustainable projects, some of them are looking out at over a year.
yeah, exactly.
And so it's really interesting how you kind of bring the perspective of from a consumer goods standpoint. I think a lot of the time people focus on, climate change as a whole and not really like the incremental impacts it has on ground level day to day.
Absolutely.
Another topic that kind of is really prevalent right now is scope emissions and the impact that that can have. I know that, you can speak to that probably with how good and what you guys are seeing across your sort of analysis of scope emissions within your own company, if you'd like to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for anyone who's not familiar, most of the industry typically follows the GHG protocol, and it's basically just kind of a directory and guidance in terms of how do I as a corporation account for all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are tied to my company.
Yeah.
And the way that they do that is they separate greenhouse gas emissions, to your point, into 3 different scopes. So scope 1 is essentially direct emissions. And what this means is we need to account for emissions that happen literally on our property. So this could be like looking at emissions from our facilities that we own. This could also be if we own a company vehicle fleet, right? That would all fall into scope 1 emissions. And then we also have scope 2 emissions, which are pretty straightforward to account for. This is where EnergyLink would play into. This is basically accounting for any purchased electricity that we kind of procure on behalf of the company. So the emissions don't necessarily happen on our site, right? They're happening at the plant, whatever that looks like. But that's basically looking at, our purchase energy, multiplying that with the emission factor appropriate to the specific region and producing the GHG emissions there. And then the way that we think about scope 3, which is the last scope, is anything that doesn't fall into scope 1 and 2. So it's kind of like that catch-all outside of that.
Yeah.
And that is where a lot of the work that I do at How Good typically falls in. So when we're thinking about fashion, when we're thinking about food, typically the largest portion of scope 3 emissions comes from a category called purchased goods and services. And this is the raw materials that you were speaking to. This is the transportation from the tier 1 supplier to the corporate's facility or manufacturing site, whatever that might look like. So yeah, I'm so happy to work in typically where the majority of emissions comes from the consumer goods side of things.
Yeah, and I think so many people don't realize the impact that these scope emissions can have, right down to, like you said, sourcing the packaging for your goods sold. If you're not picking a sustainable packaging or you're picking a packaging that has a really high carbon footprint to be able to get it to market, you're also contributing to the issues that globally we're facing when it comes to,
Exactly. And beyond packaging too, like for food, we actually know that according to our world and data, 71% of the GHG impact comes from land use change and agricultural production pertaining to the ingredients. And a very small percentage actually comes from packaging and transportation. And so this is a really interesting, I don't know if revelation is the right word, but there's so much education happening now to say, okay, if we really want to invest and reduce our environmental risk, this is actually where we should pay the most attention to. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, and you totally caught me in it. I'm sort of assumptive that, it's the sustainability of packaging, but you have a far deeper understanding, and that's really where the importance of being able to speak to ESG investors and say, hey, you see the word sustainable and you think like, let's throw some money at it. Well, you need to be able to differentiate between a company that's just saying they're putting these measures in place, and a company like How Good that has really done the market analysis and run the data to be able to understand where those bottlenecks are in terms of improving your sustainability and improving your carbon footprint. So
absolutely,
it's great to hear someone who really understands their company's
yeah. And the deeper I think that you study it and understand that, the better I think your ESG strategy will be, both as like a personal investor kind of thing, but also just kind of analyzing the larger landscape at whole. It's certainly been valuable.
Yeah, I think, from our seat now, investors are looking at ESG goals and ESG metrics of a company as a non-financial factor to whether they should invest. So definitely a space that's going to grow over the next few years. It's great to get to talk to you about it. Oh, go on.
And I was going to say, and energy is such a big part of it, even though, like, again, for the majority of consumer products, Scope 3 is the biggest part there. But oftentimes we know that Scope 2, in terms of purchased electricity, is the easiest, and I'm overgeneralizing, but like the easiest to calculate, which is great. So you can get that baseline. And also we know that renewables are now finally cost competitive with fossil fuels. And so that seems to be the thing that is moving the quickest within these corporations, which is wonderful and leading to reduced emissions. So yeah, energy is so important as well, and a huge part of this in terms of like what is tangible that we can work on today within the next 2 years, rather than how do we change our whole supply system to supply more sustainable raw materials kind of thing.
100%. And that's what, you spoke to education in your space. That's where education for us is coming in, is helping companies realize, there's cost parity, like you mentioned with fossil fuels. And there's also companies that fully understand how to implement these projects for you. You're not having to deal with 5, 6, 7 different entities. You can go to specialized companies, like EnergyLink, and we can provide the funding and the capital up front. A lot of people don't realize that. And B, it can be completely bespoke to the goals that you're trying to achieve, whether it's financial or whether it's something different, and like the years in which you want that project to run. I mean, everything can be tailored now. So really exciting stuff. Kind of gone off on a tangent there. I think just before we close, let's talk a little bit about your passion projects. We touched on the Sustainable Network at the beginning, but why don't you kind of talk to us a little bit about what it is, where you're going with it, and how people can get involved if they'd like to be involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the Sustainable Network is many different things. It's really, from a professional sense, I really study and try to understand what is preventing consumer adoption for more sustainable purchasing decisions. So an example would be like, why are consumers kind of hesitant to try Beyond Meat or Impossible Meat, for example? And so once I have those answers, just from my own personal research, I try to develop content to kind of address that. So for example, I learned that a lot of people are hesitant in terms of like the ingredients and things along those lines. So I really tried to develop content so consumers can understand, what are the ingredients? How do they compare to actual meat? What do the nutrition facts look like side by side? So that's kind of an idea of the content that I try to work on. And then I also have an email newsletter that I celebrate sustainable business practices. And so that's more of the B2B side of things that anyone can sign up for on my website. And the idea there is really just to bring insight to the larger business community to say, look what this company is doing, look at the results that it's achieved, and here's how we can celebrate it both in our own business practices as professionals, but also as consumers, kind of bringing all of that together. So yeah, I have an Instagram, I have that email newsletter, website, so variety of different channels. Yeah, you can just Google it and hopefully we'll be able to interact there.
No, I think it's brilliant, that you are taking the initiative to educate on a space that is only going to grow in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And being at the forefront as a thought leader is really great. And we feel very privileged to have had you on to kind of talk to us about what you do today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again. It was great.
Yeah, you have a lovely afternoon. And if anybody would like to see what Christina's up to, we will post some links to her projects.
Bye. Thank you.